Perspective this week debates the pros and cons of introducing legislation to allow assisted dying. I'm joined in the studio by Dr Alex Allinson, MHK, Dr Ben Harris, Peter Murcott and Quinton Gill. So why did Quinton try to introduce a similar bill in 2003?
Well, my motivation and that of John, it was a shared view that the whole debate around assisted dying or whatever form that activity would reflect was important, that it was openly considered and that it was debated, and that we formed an opinion whatever the outcome would be. And if I'm being candid, we anticipated that the tumult that we looked around and assessed the positions of other members, it wouldn't be successful in actually moving legislation. But we did think it was the effect that we wanted was to introduce the issue and to have it debated openly, and to get it on the agenda and to keep it on the agenda. And in that, I think we were successful.
Obviously, the committee did a huge amount of work back then. What happened ultimately to the attempt to move the legislation?
Well, the report you mentioned actually was extremely well written. It was by a lady called Jenny Helps, and who was, I think, a double first from Oxford, and it absolutely showed it was a quality, fair, balanced, but evidence-based report. And I know subsequently it was in demand from countries across the Commonwealth who were having the same debate that we were. So in terms of just credibility and competence, I think it set a really fair ground rules. But sure enough, as John Remington and I had anticipated, the three schools in Tynwald at that time were very much skewed. Of those of us who had a considered view, who were in favour in principle, those who were against for considered views in principle, were probably equal minority numbers, and the balance in the middle was, look, we don't need this, let's not upset anybody in the UK, blah blah, and therefore inertia of Tynwald ruled the day, and we ran out of time. So the issue was on the political agenda in the widest scale, but in terms of Tynwald, it fell at that point, and which is what we anticipated. But I think still it was an exercise that has led to where we are today, and I hope that will be a good foundation.
Alex Allinson, you've decided to pick up on this again. I think you tried in the previous House. Is that correct?
I had a motion in 2020 about assisted dying, which was a Tynwald motion to explore the appetite. And at that time, I think Tynwald members were interested but wanted more information. But then, of course, the world changed, and we got into COVID, and so things were stalled. I mean, I'd like to thank Quinton for the work. I completely agree with him. When you look through the report, which ended up being published, I think, in 2006, it still stands the test of time. I mean, it's a very good report, goes through all the various arguments pro and against the assisted dying, and really is a bedrock of some of those things going forward. And obviously, since then, Joan Watterson tried to bring a private member's bill through as well. So we've been talking about this quite seriously in Tynwald for the last 2 decades. And certainly last year, I thought it was time to bring this up again. I was extremely grateful for the House of Keys for giving me leave to introduce a private member's bill, and so we're now going through the process of that with a public consultation, exploring the ideas again. But as Quinton said, these arguments, the wish of people to have dignity at a time of their death isn't going to go away. Hasn't gone away for the last couple of decades, and I think now we have a different Tynwald. I think with all due respect, probably a more diverse background of people and ideas, which I hope will be able to consider this as we go forward.
And in terms of going forward, clearly the consultation has only just closed. Well, I suppose the first question then is, what can you tell us about the consultation?
Just that there seems to have been a lot of interest from the public, from various groups on the Isle of Man. and also internationally with lots of submissions. I don't have the exact number of those, but it's been a well-used consultation. What happens now is that the Tynwald office will try to collate all those bits of information, the written submissions, the electronic submissions, will produce a report which goes through people's views, and on the basis of that, then look at legislation to come forward. The leave to introduce a private member's bill gives me access to a legal drafter. And as I said, we have had several attempts to bring through private members' bills in the past, as they have in the United Kingdom, through Westminster, particularly the House of Lords, as we are now seeing through the Scottish Parliament, and certainly also in Jersey. But with Jersey, the government are actually bringing through legislation and have gone through the prospect of a citizens' jury to do this rather than a public consultation. So the next step really is to look at the results of the public consultation, look at how those might influence a bit of legislation coming through, and then get that drafted.
And I suppose there was confusion, a little bit of confusion anyway, in some people's minds in Tynwald, in the January Tynwald, that trying to understand the difference between a private member's bill and a government bill. I think that was reasonably cleared up. But why does government not decide to bring forward a piece of legislation like this?
Well, at the start of each administration, normally the Chief Minister will set out their policies that they want to pursue. And in the past, we've had programmes for government. In this administration, we've got an Ireland plan, which is very much a consensual a collection of ideas and the way of driving policy, strategy and legislation forward. Now, there are various social policies, particularly in this case on assisted dying, which aren't really part of that Ireland plan. And that's one of the great privileges of being a member of the House of Keys, is that you have the ability to promote these sort of ideas that often can't be defined by one particular department, one particular minister, really cross over into social policy, and I would advocate human rights as well, to allow those to progress. And I'm very grateful to the House for giving me that leave.
Ben Harris, you're one of the doctors that has been, I think it's fair to say, critical of the principle of assisted dying. Why would you not want to give people the choice in these incredibly difficult circumstances to end their lives?
Well, when you say that sounds a very reasonable thing, doesn't it? Unfortunately, that isn't how assisted dying plays out, and certainly it isn't how it's played out in the number of jurisdictions where it has been introduced. And it's interesting looking back to that select committee that was 20 years ago now. A huge amount has changed, and I think if this bill does come to Tynwald, then I think having a select committee to look at the issues as they are in 2023 would be an extremely valuable part of its passage through Tynwald. You mentioned the consultation, and it's a curious process where Alex, who has made his views extremely clear that he wants to see assisted dying in the Isle of Man, is then tasked with writing the consultation and creating the questions, and indeed analysing the results. And I think, many people would say that there can only be one conclusion to that type of an exercise. And a number of people have suggested that it is a bit leading in its construction.
And indeed, this is often suggested about government consultations. Whether it's fair or not is another matter. Overall, though, you are opposed in principle to having legislation to allow assisted dying, aren't you?
That's correct, and that is having spent my whole career working with the care of the dying, end of life care. I think it would be a bad situation for the Isle of Man and for patients in the Isle of Man receiving serious diagnoses if that legislation was in place, because at that point they are extremely vulnerable. Many reports have indicated the high levels of depression that occur when receiving that kind of bad news, of that kind of diagnosis, and all of those things could affect somebody's choice. So it wouldn't perhaps be a really free choice. The other big issue, of course, is that when does a choice become an enforced obligation? People are frightened of being a burden on their families. I mean, certainly in Oregon, 54% of people subject to assisted dying said that they do it because they don't want to be a burden on their families. Is that really their free choice, or is it a societal obligation?
Peter Murcott, obviously, you're also bringing balance from the other side. You're not a big supporter, in fact, you're not a supporter at all of assisted dying, are you?
The bill properly described is actually assisted suicide, and one of the things that I discovered when there were various meetings about this, that there was a great deal of confusion amongst the public of exactly what the bill was doing. I pointed out that the bill would seek to amend Section 2, subsection 1 of the Criminal Law Act 1981, which created the offence, the primary offence of aiding, abetting, counselling or procuring a suicide. So the first point I would make is I would value clarity to be well known to people, because I find assisted dying is a vague expression that could cover a number of scenarios. And as I've read the proposals, they do amount to assisted suicide, so I shall call it that. The first thing is the bill would be against the word of God. Now, some people will say, well, I don't believe in God, and so that is probably not relevant. However, that leads on to the second point. The bill is against the fundamental constitution of the land, because the Isle of Man recognises King Charles III as Lord of Man, and while they do so, he is under a statutory obligation to maintain to the utmost of his powers the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel. So whether you believe in God or whether you don't, the fact is he has that legal responsibility, and this bill would create a constitutional crisis for the king, which I can describe later if I have time. And the third thing is that it has been said quite rightly that there are not words that can satisfactorily define what is and what is not offside, because experience shows in these other jurisdictions that what start off as ferocious safeguards, they get less ferocious as the time goes on. And that has been the pattern all the way through. And I might say the fourth thing is, having come from one Celtic country to another, I find the bill to be countercultural, because certainly I came from Wales before I came to the Isle of Man, and I think it goes against some very deep-seated views that Manx people have, and certainly the views that they would have had in Wales with regard to life and death. And I think that they would shrink from becoming involved in enabling another person to commit suicide.
Does public opinion matter in these circumstances?
Is public opinion what, sorry?
Does it matter in these circumstances?
I think public opinion certainly matters. One of the problems with a consultation like this is, however well you do it and however carefully you do it, it is very difficult to gauge public opinion, because I come back to the point that I found that quite a number of the members of the public were quite frankly not clear about what the legislation was proposing. Now, I was clear because I'd read it and I could understand it, but then I've had legal training, so I would be able to do that, but most people couldn't, and it took quite a bit of explanation as to what exactly they were being consulted about.
Dr Allinson, then, is it fair to say that the consultation, people have been led by the nose with the consultation? Are the questions leading?
Well, as you said, arguing against the process of consultations it is quite common, when people disagree with the principles that are being discussed. In terms of the assisted dying consultation, you're quite right. It's a private member's bill, so it is down to me to think about how to consult. I don't think there's any statutory obligation to consult on a private member's bill, but we do, because we like to involve people. And it's not an opinion survey. It's trying to elicit ideas and stimulate debate. And I'd like to thank you and the other people around this table for taking part in that debate. That's the whole thing about a democracy. So you're quite right. I had to write the answers. I had to explain what I mean by assisted dying, which is really it describes a process of prescribing on request life-ending medications to an individual, an adult with mental capacity who is already dying with a terminal diagnosis, in order to give them the means to control the manner and timing of their own death. And the consultation, some of the wording was based on the Scottish consultation, which attracted over 14,000 submissions. And I liaised with Liam MacArthur, the Scottish MP, regarding that, to try to get it right. We have had various opinion surveys, both here, the other the Channel Islands, and in the UK. And when you ask binary questions about assisted dying, the vast majority of people will say yes. But I think when you drill down to some of the technicalities and intricacies of what we mean, that then people then start questioning exactly what their own views are. And that was one of the ideas about the consultation, was to start talking about how it would work in principle, so that we can draft the right legislation to reflect some of those technicalities that are involved.
Quentin, you're a counter cultural in supporting this piece of legislation.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that logic follows through, but I think I would just take issue with any suggestion that Dr Allinson is somehow judge and jury and it's a done job. If anybody had come to Tynwald and said, we'll have a referendum on introducing this and it'll be binding, well, referendum's not really a very good way of making big decisions. That would probably be an abuse of a process, because it would be unfair, uninformed, and unengaged in a meaningful way. You'd be asking people to make a yes or no decision. That's not happened. What is a perfectly legitimate consultation. I have every confidence it will be open. Tynwald will hold Dr Allinson's feet to the fire to make sure it's been fair and it's not been biased, whatever the outcomes are. And Peter's concerns about a constitutional crisis coming out of legislation like this gets thrown up with every bit of social legislation. The end of the world will happen if we give women the vote, or if we give 16-year-olds the vote, or if we introduce an abortion bill or abortion legislation, or whatever. Any social legislation, the establishment invariably throws this constitutional card into the fray. And we tested that with the then attorney in 2003, who was absolutely against us having anything contrary to the United Kingdom government, but he wouldn't actually go so far as to state it. But that was the clear inference. However, in the 2 decades since then, you've seen it yourself, Phil, that the UK has devolved powers, legislations and rights to all parts of the UK on a regional and on a national basis, and we are no different from that. And this is a Manx matter, and whilst I hear and accept Peter's concerns that some people on the island would have the concerns he described, I think at the end of the day this is a Manx matter for Manx people to decide, and I do not think there is any realistic suggestion that royal assent would be withheld. It's simply unfathomable to extend that argument.
And presumably that's an argument that's going to be tested if Jersey supports their attempt at assisted dying, Peter.
I think that there's a big misunderstanding about the royal assent. I had a long discussion on this question with Lord Lisvane when he came over. First thing is, the royal assent still could be refused. The point that I'm making is that legislation like this is premature. The first thing that any of the devolved assemblies or Parliament in Westminster, whatever, have got to do, because royal assent applies to all of the assemblies that there are from Jersey or wherever. They need to petition the United Kingdom government to change the Coronation Oath Act, Section 3. Now, that would be the first thing, because what is not appreciated is that the monarch is put in an impossible position between a rock and a hard place. The monarch has a statutory duty that's personal to him. It was established in 1688. It was a fundamental plank of the establishment of constitutional monarchy. And Parliament of the day, and no Parliament has chosen to change it, laid down that to accept the crown in 1688, the king, and it was actually a king and queen at that time, William III, Mary II, they had to agree to a statutory form of the coronation oath. And it's very, very clear. It says that the king solemnly swears to the utmost of his power to maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel. Now, that's what Parliament wanted. And here you have a complete conundrum. Parliament on one side is putting on the head of state a legal obligation to maintain the laws of God. On the other side, you have a Parliament passing or proposing or talking about passing legislation which in fact puts him on a collision course. And so what does the king do? He's on the one side, he cannot ignore that act because he comes up against another piece of legislation, which is the Bill of Rights Act 1689. And the Bill of Rights Act was again fundamental to constitutional monarchy because the previous monarch was taking on himself to suspend or dispense with the law, and that was why he got overthrown. And to stop that eventuality, Parliament wrote into the Bill of Rights Act, which is still in force, that the pretended suspending and dispensing power is hereby declared null and void. So, if the king, because of the constitutional crisis that would arise, sets aside or ignores the Coronation Oath Act, which places on him a statutory obligation, what else is he doing but dispensing with the law on that particular issue, in which case he is going against a very fundamental principle that is applicable directly to the monarchy. And so I would contend that before you even start to have a bill like this, what the members of the legislatures need to do, remembering that they swear an oath of allegiance to the monarch, is to assist the monarch, while the Coronation Oath Act endures, to assist the monarch by refraining from passing any legislation that brings about this constitutional crisis. Because if the king refused the royal assent, he immediately would have a major crisis on his hands, which might even bring the end to the monarchy. And yet on the other side, he's got this legal obligation. Who would like to be in that position? And I do think that each legislature has got to face the facts, and they've got to face up to those facts. They have an oath of allegiance to assist His Majesty, and they can do it in two ways. One, they can do what I said a moment ago. They can petition Parliament to amend or to repeal or to change the coronation oath. Or secondly, they themselves have got to refrain from passing legislation which calls the oath into question. There isn't a third way, in my view.
And it's a great view, and I'd love to spend time debating the complex constitutional relationship that we have with the United Kingdom, and indeed, you know, that we could debate as well the reasons for the coronation oath being drafted in the way that it is, which was all about the Anglican faith not wanting the Catholic faith to potentially get a foothold back in terms of the monarchy. But I think, Ben, if we could maybe bring this back to people, are there ever occasions where people in your care say, actually, I really do feel that I can't go on anymore, and I don't really want to have to live this life any longer?
I can honestly say that hasn't been a feature of my work on the Isle of Man. I mean, the advocates for assisted dying, they speak a lot about people suffering, and you know that suffering is a very subjective phenomenon, and it certainly isn't inevitable. We all suffer to some extent through our lives, and continue. And it always alarms me when terrible suffering is described as inevitable, because of how that makes anybody feel who is receiving that kind of diagnosis. In fact, time leading up to death can be very valuable in people's lives. It can be a time of reconciliation for friends and families. The time leading up to death is a part of life. There was an Indian poet, Tagore, who said that death belongs to life as birth does. The walk is in the raising of the foot as in the laying of it down. And so that very end of life, or that period at the very end of life, is just as important as any other. And the proposals are that essentially somebody with 6 months left to live, the implication is that perhaps their life isn't worth living anymore. And I would refute that and say that life is always worth living if somebody feels cared for and looked after.
So Alex, I mean, I suppose I ask the same question of you. Have you ever been in a position where you've been caring for someone whose life is obviously coming to an end, and they've asked you for, is there no way that my life can be shortened?
Many times, actually, and one patient actually asked me to fill out a form for Dignitas because she wanted to go to Switzerland, and I contacted the General Medical Council because at the moment that would be illegal, and they said you can't fill out the form, you can't advise her on any assisted suicide, you can't even give her clinical notes to take with her. She has to request those, because if you do, you'll be breaking the law, and theoretically you'll be struck off because of our legislation at the moment. And Ben previously talked about Oregon, and they when people apply for assisted dying, they ask about end of life concerns, and he's right that being a burden to family, friends, and caregivers, 54% of people say that, but 93% of people say their main concern is losing autonomy. 92% of people say they're less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable, and 68% of people say that their main concern at the end of life is loss of dignity. And so when we're talking about suffering, when we're talking about stress, it's not just the pain. And I agree with Ben that modern palliative care can relieve a lot of those symptoms, and we need to get away from people being frightened about death, because it is a natural part of life. But what we need to do is listen to those people and listen to their fears, and that loss of autonomy and loss of dignity is a main fear to a very small number of people who decide that they would like to be in control of their own death. And the reality is, unfortunately, we know that people are taking things into their own hands, and we know that people are suiciding with terminal illness, and there's good statistics about that. And that's done without the support, without being able to tell people, because they're worried about that they might get their relatives and their loved ones into trouble by doing this. And so this if all else, this debate hopefully will allow people to talk about death in a mature way, will allow people to be open about their own wishes with their families and friends, and I would like to respect those wishes.
Quentin, then, I mean, I don't know. You're like Peter and myself. You're like a non-qualified bystander to the debate the doctors have just had there. On the one hand, one doctor has said that they've never been approached by anyone to have their life ended, and another one who said on many occasions they have. Is this potentially one of the concerns that is often expressed for those who would oppose this legislation, that it's about differences in approach, perhaps, from medical staff. So some who are more supportive of the principle of assisted dying will perhaps be more inclined to encourage or be sympathetic to that particular cause.
I can't say, but I'm sure your premise is right, that people make an assessment of the person they're speaking to, and are they going to get the response that they're looking for from that person, and that's not any nature of criticism. I would take issue that you say I'm not qualified. You are qualified. Peter is qualified. Everybody in this room and listening to this programme is qualified, because we are talking about choice at the end of life, which will affect every one of us inevitably. And I think, as Dr Allinson very eloquently just outlined, they are matters that are valid, that should be considered openly. And I personally feel that actually both sides can have, with respect and tolerance, can take away from the end of this process, hopefully with legislation, with checks and balances and safeguards introduced and adhered to, as I think they are in other mature democracies where they've introduced this legislation. I think where that happens, people absolutely rightly have the opt-out as professionals or as individuals who would be affected by these issues to make their own choice and say, this is not what I want for whatever reason, and that should be completely respected. And I don't think anybody is suggesting anything to the alternative of that. But the corollary of that is those people like myself who actually think about my death while I've got some degree of mental capacity. I think I would like to have that opinion honoured at the point in my life when I'm nearing the end of my life. And I don't see what is so difficult as a concept. Certainly the practicalities, yes, they need to be absolutely clarified and dealt with and managed. But in terms of the concept, it really is a matter of mutual respect, and I hope that will be reflected in the legislative outcome.
Ben, is it about different approaches from different people? I mean, is that perhaps the reason why no one has said to you, as they approach the end of their life, that they would like their lives shortened?
Well, you know, I mean, the scenario that Alex describes, I mean, could have been dealt with in a different way. I mean, it could have been that the doctor might have looked at the underlying motivation for the request and perhaps had tried to address the psychological pain and symptom management that perhaps the lady was experiencing, and reassure her about ongoing care provision for her and her family, possibly refer her to palliative care services, and generally make her feel worthwhile and cared for. And that might have led to her feeling quite differently about her outlook, and then choosing to continue with her life rather than following through with assisted dying. But the other point I'd like to pick up from Alex, because Alex talked about a small number, that it might be appropriate for a small number of people. And I think this kind of legislation is often justified by very unusual and extreme cases. But what concerns me is that once it's been brought in, the numbers completely explode. And although many people deny it, the what's called the slippery slope phenomenon is very much alive and well. And the number of jurisdictions where that has occurred far outweighs those where that stuck to the original legislation. Certainly numbers in Holland, Belgium and Canada have hugely expanded. It becomes very run-of-the-mill. In Canada, which I think is probably perhaps the worst jurisdiction for assisted dying gone wrong, they don't talk anymore about a slippery slope, but rather about falling off a cliff. And there was in the national newspapers before Christmas an article, the killing fields of liberal Canada. There's only one line in the sand, and that's not to permit deliberate killing for any reason, and that is the current law in the Isle of Man, and I would say that served us well as a society for the last 1,000 years.
Alex, then, I mean, the problem I suppose, in relation to any of this is we can't go back and find out whether people who have benefited, in your view perhaps benefited from assisted dying, whether they actually had second thoughts, because they're not in a position to be able to say that. Are you leading us down a slippery slope?
I think the slippery slope argument has been used for lots of progressive social legislation, whether that be legalising homosexuality, whether that be same-sex marriage, whether that be abortion reform. And really, when you look at those jurisdictions who have expanded their provision, it's been a stepwise approach by their parliaments. Particularly in Canada, they passed an assisted dying and euthanasia law, and I'm not talking about euthanasia here. Assisted dying and euthanasia law in 2016. In 2019 that was changed, and it was due to be changed this year to encompass people with severe mental illnesses. Now, I'm certainly not advocating that, and I have personal, ethical and medical issues against that extension. But their parliament has stalled that and asked for more information. And so, again, I think it is quite important. We've got two politicians here. This is very much up to Tynwald as the representatives of the people to get the right law, but to make sure that it has the checks and balances. There are the slippery slopes in terms of Tynwald legislation are few and far between. Everyone accuses us of acting too slowly rather than too quickly in most cases. But to come back to your original question in terms of whether people change their mind, at this, we're dealing with people who are facing an imminent death. Most of the legislations in other countries give a period of time for reflection, for asking them what they want, for informing them of the options of palliative care, but also for having two opinions that this is for them. When you look across all the jurisdictions, and we're talking, again, this isn't radical new legislation. It is the state of play. It is the right of over 200 million people around the world for this, including many Commonwealth countries who have the king as their head of state. When you look at the statistics, when people are provided with the means to achieve an assisted death, around about 2/3 of them end up taking it, but a third don't. But for that third, it gives them that security, that peace, that they have that choice. But they carry on and die of more natural causes of their underlying condition. And so I think, while I completely understand these concerns, I think through having well-crafted, debated legislation on the Isle of Man, we can overcome them.
I'll bring Quinton in shortly, but Peter, I'm aware I've neglected you for a little while here. Is one of the most fundamental aspects of any democracy that the will of the people should be reasonably reflected in the laws of the land?
That's certainly the way things have developed. And, of course, it's very difficult to ascertain, though, the will of the people, as we've already explored. And I'm not sure that consultations do that, because no one has yet devised a satisfactory method of being able to ascertain exactly what the will, because many people have many misconceptions. But could I just raise a point here about about the medical profession, a legal point, because I'm not qualified to talk about medical issues, and I won't even try. But I've looked closely at the question of those people who do not wish to be involved. Now, I pointed out at the very beginning that this bill is going to amend the existing law on aiding, abetting, counselling and procuring a suicide, which was passed in 1981 for reasons that I won't expand on because it'll waste time. I've looked at the conscience clause, and I have to say that the conscience clause as drafted is worthless, and I'll tell you why. Because what happens is that those people who are required to send an inquirer to someone else are still caught in the aiding, abetting, counselling and procuring. I would suggest that they're probably counselling and procuring the thing. Let me put it another way. If under the present law A comes to B and says, will you give me, will you help me to commit suicide? And B says, no, I won't, but I'll send you to someone who will. I am pretty certain that that person would fall under the ambit of the present law. Now, under this one, it says that the doctor or the pharmacist or whoever who doesn't wish to be involved is required to send them to someone who will. And as I read, I was very interested in reading Dr Allinson's remarks, which were in the Manx Independent, which actually confirm what I'm saying. He explains how somebody came to him and wanted to go to Dignitas, and he couldn't write the letter because he was properly told by some superior body that would be aiding and abetting, and giving advice would still come under that, because that would actually, if we want to be very technical, it probably comes under the counselling of or procuring. Let me just explain in passing, there are actually 4 offences in that. That isn't one offence. You could be charged technically with any one of those 4 offences. I've given a lot of thought to this, and basing it on what he says, quite properly what he says here, what would happen if this bill gets through as it is? The pharmacist, the doctor, the medical professional who doesn't want to be involved is actually dragged into it, whether he likes it or not, by being obliged to send the inquirer to someone else. He is doing none other than counselling the start of the assisted suicide. Now, whatever else that is, it isn't conscience. It's actually pinching people's consciences. And so what we have here, you hear an awful lot of people saying, well, it's my choice that I want to do this. But let me tell you that under this bill, my choice becomes somebody else's conscience, and that cannot be right.
Quentin, is it fair to expect people to effectively undertake actions that morally that they're opposed to?
The legislation has always allowed for professionals or individuals as participants in whatever role to opt out of that, as I understand, and I'm sure Dr Allinson will be able to amplify that. So and it's certainly in 2003 that was always the understanding that would be the case. I don't accept the rigid interpretation that Peter repeatedly comes back to, laws dating back to 1688 hampering domestic legislation. Your point, if I may say, on a political programme was about should the legislature reflect public opinion. Yes, it shouldn't just be the most popular vox pop and they will just go along with that. It's got to be considered, and that's what we're doing. We're considering these matters, and we're introducing a measure which would be safeguarded and would be appropriate and would be receiving a democratic mandate. And I would just reflect that what we've heard in argument against that is really the slippery slope argument is a variation on the, as we hear for every bit of social legislation, if this happens, it's the end of the world. If women get the vote, everything will stop functioning properly. If 16-year-olds get the vote, they're far too immature. I remember that argument. And you know what? I look at the 16-year-olds who vote. That is a minority, but they are making an active choice as responsible, in some cases, tax-paying individuals. So there's always this argument is thrown up. It's the end of the world if we do this. It's a step too far. We can wait. It's premature. Do you know what? Tynwald's duty is to reflect wishes of the overwhelming number of the public, not only on the Isle of Man, but in the United Kingdom, certainly, who say this is a legitimate political agenda item and we want it to be dealt with.
Alex, is 2 weeks a long enough cooling off period between someone making a decision that yes, indeed, they want assistance in dying or committing suicide, as Peter would have it? 2 weeks seems like a remarkably short spell of time to me when it's such a big and fundamentally important decision to take.
Well, again, if I can just make it quite clear that there isn't a bill that's been written yet. That was one of the ideas of the consultations, to elicit some of these questions. When I've talked to physicians who have actually been providing assisted dying services to their patients, both in Australia and in California, they often say that obviously before somebody comes to them, they've thought about this for huge amounts of time and at huge lengths, and often discussed it with their family and their relatives before they come through. And there are always, options for people to change their mind. Is 2 weeks too long? Some countries have had a month. And what they found is that people have deteriorated during that month and not being able to use the service that was offered to them. So again, that's one of the things that I hope we can debate on the floor of Tynwald, in terms of looking at the evidence from around the world, looking at the way people think about consent, and the rights of people to consent to various treatments, even a treatment such as assisted dying, and say what is the right thing for our island.
Well, we are sadly approaching the end of the programme now, so I wonder whether perhaps in maybe 40 seconds, whether you could each summarise your position, and whether you've been influenced in any way by the debate so far. Maybe Peter, if you could, can you manage 30 to 40 seconds?
No, I've not been the slightest bit influenced by the debate, because I've studied this many times. I've studied right from what happened in Germany. I'll just say you one thing. The biggest irony of the lot, Holland was the country that took this on board. During the Second World War, the Führer tried to impose euthanasia on Holland. Occupied Holland preferred to go to concentration camps rather than initiate it. Democratic Holland has done what the Führer wasn't able to do, and that's got to be the biggest irony of history, I think.
Ben, a perhaps less colourful summary.
Well, I think perhaps the debate has reinforced to your listeners that the force behind this assisted dying legislation is more about politics and ideology, rather than any genuine concern for people coping with serious and potentially fatal diagnoses. This type of legislation threatens the weak and vulnerable, and I'd like my last comments to use the words of the current Manx bard, Michael Manning. Because let's not forget that the strength of any society is judged by how well it looks after its weakest members. And Michael Manning said that the rights of the strong must not compromise the protection of the weak.
Quentin, a very brief summary of where we're at.
Well, I'm disappointed to hear that the argument in favour of choice, a matter which affects everybody at some point in their life, is dismissed as being a political agenda rather than a sincere reflection of concern for other humans. I don't accept that, and I don't think that's appropriate. And I just hope that whatever the outcome, it's calmly measured and evidence-based, and I hope that Tynwald will reflect the measures that are reflected in the consultation, and I hope that Tynwald and the Isle of Man generally should be proud to own whatever the process is that flows from this, because it's a Manx matter and it should be dealt with by our legislature.
And a final comment then, Alex, you're the perpetrator or the proponent of this, depending on which side of the argument you sit. Have you been influenced by any of the discussion, or are you pretty sure that you know where you're going with this?
Absolutely. Again, as we said, Tynwald have been discussing this for over 2 decades, and now is the time, I think, to discuss it again. The medical profession is a very broad church. There's lots of different viewpoints there and different ideals and experiences. And that mirrors, in many ways, our society, and should mirror the people who are put by our community to represent them in Tynwald. I completely respect people with other viewpoints on assisted dying. And they, if this bill is successful, have every right not to take up that service, but for that small number of people who would benefit from it, who it would give them solace and peace towards the end of their life, I think that is worthwhile fighting for.
That was Dr Alex Allinson, MHK, Dr Ben Harris, Peter Murcott and Quinton Gill. I hope you found their discussion informative. Are we ready to accept and indeed cope with the pressures and unforeseen consequences associated with rights to assisted dying? For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn, Guramaeus and Geisha Grum. Thanks for listening.